Hello and welcome to Cymera, Britain's only book festival celebrating science fiction, fantasy and horror writing. My name is Anne Landman and I'm the festival's founder and artistic director. Right about now, I'd hope to be welcoming you to beautiful Edinburgh, to our venue The Pleasance, for a weekend packed with events. Writing workshop, panels, readings, open mics, a quiz, a ceilidh, 2 plays. We had so much in store for you. Thank you for joining us online instead, to be part of our programme from the safety of your homes. We're very excited to still bring you a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'd ask you that you support our speakers, and there's many ways you can do that. You can buy their books or borrow them from the library. You can donate to them directly via their Patreon or Ko-fi. You will find the links for that below in the description. We encourage you to buy a ticket for our events, even the pre-recorded ones. All ticket money will go directly to our speakers. You can also donate to the festival, and all donations via the donation page will be split between our speakers, once we've covered our costs like the Zoom account. Thank you again for joining us in this brave new world of digital events. We hope you have a chance to check out all 33 of ours over the weekend. Please let us know what you think of them. Do get in touch via social media, the chat function in Zoom, or drop us an email on info@cymerafestival.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year for Cymera2021.
Welcome to Cymera, Scotland's Festival of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Writing. My name is Anne and I am the Festival Director. And before we come to our main event, which is the fantastic panel we have lined up for you now, we have a very special reading for you. We run a strand called Brave New Words, which is designed to help emerging writers based right here in Scotland to reach a wider audience. So our reader and it's a 5-minute reading, and our reader for this particular panel is Callum McSorley. Callum McSorley is an author based in Aberdeenshire. His short stories have appeared in Gutter Magazine, the Glasgow Review of Books, Monsters Regiment, and Shoreline of Infinity, among others. Today, however, he is reading from his debut fantasy noir novel, Burying the Dragon, which will be out in August by Mobius Books. So please, from where you are sitting comfortably, please put your hands together for Callum McSorley.
An eruption had rendered the sky black, leaving little daylight to filter through the thick groves of cherry trees. The usual scent of evergreen was crushed by the rotten egg smell of sulphur and burnt charcoal. Mother and father had warned Sato not to wander into the forest with the sun hidden as it was. Even Fujisan could no longer be seen above the treetops, so he was keeping himself amused in the hotel garden, throwing small stones into the fish pond and watching the carp dart away from the ripples. When he got bored of that, he tried climbing up one of the rain chains to get onto the low eaved roof of the inn. Mother, who was washing the floors upstairs, stuck her head out a window to scold him, so he went back to harassing the fish. His sister Kiko was busy reading. "Come and see the sky. I've seen it. Go away." He picked up a willow branch brush and set about sweeping the stones in the rock garden that father had carefully sculpted into something like an image of the mountain. This earned him another telling off, and he eventually lay down on his back to stare at the blackened sky and accept that he would die of utter boredom and loneliness, unwanted. The snapping of a branch pulled him from his pouting. There, beyond the gate, was an animal he'd never seen before, not in real life anyway. He recognised it from books and pictures as some sort of elk. However, though it had the goat-like face and the long straight horns on its head, its fur was a deep reddish brown, the colour of the sun in his father's Fuji mural. Sato got up slowly, so as not to startle the animal, though it seemed far from skittish. It wasn't sniffing at the ground or chewing at the grass, and neither its tail nor its ears flicked with irritation at the mosquitoes. It was looking right at him, holding his gaze. Sato felt it beckoning him to come closer. He took careful steps towards it, excitement just about taking over fear. It had a thick, powerful neck, covered in so much shaggy, russet hair, it was like a lion's mane. As he reached out to touch it, it snorted loudly, making Sato pull back his hand as if it had been slapped with a bamboo switch. The red elk turned and walked back towards the forest. As it reached the tree line, it looked over its shoulder, fixing Sato on its gaze again. Then it headed into the forest, shrouded in the fog of ash. Sato followed. He'd grown up at the foot of the mountain. He knew nothing beyond the trees. The snow-capped crown of Fujisan was his constant backdrop, more fixed in the sky than the sun and moon. He was home among the sounds of the forest, the calls of the flycatchers and the rock ptarmigans, and wasn't the least afraid of the shadows that moved between the ancient cedars. He'd seen the insects and the squirrels and the foxes, who, like the tanuki, could change their shape and appear in many forms. Slowly, carefully, deliberately, the elk cut a trail through the woods, every so often looking over its shoulder to check if Sato was still there, following behind. For a time they ran alongside the trail which the worshippers used to climb the mountain, pay respect to great old Fujisan and the kami that lived in the trees and the birds and the water and all nature. Then they turned and dove deeper into the woodland, tottering over large roots that grew twisted and gnarled together. Sato's feet were sore, but he was compelled to keep going, as if pulled along on a leash by the elk, whose woolly red fur was vibrant even in the gloom of the trees and the smog. They reached a small clearing where the trees hadn't grown so close together. The elk padded around in a circle, then lay down, resting its chin on the earth. Its nose pointed to a pair of high, sturdy geta abandoned in the grass. Sato picked up the sandals. Why would someone leave them here, so deep in the forest, he wondered. Somebody lost? A creaking bough in the tree above made him look up, where he saw the soles of someone's bare feet dangling above him, presumably the owner of the geta. The bough creaked again under the weight of its burden, swinging in the gentle breeze. Thank you.
Awesome, Callum.
Thank you very much.
Callum, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm seeing notes in the chat that says, love that, coming from people. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Phil Sloman. I'm chairing this afternoon's panel entitled What If? We have some fantastic panelists with us. We have Mike Carey, Tim Lebbon, and Kit Power. Now, for those of you who don't know, Kit Power, so Kit's debut novel, God Bomb, which is an excellent read, was published by Sinister Horror Company in 2015. And his short fiction can be found in his book Breaking Point, and also A Warning About Your Future Enslavement that will dismiss as a collection of short fiction and collected essays by Kit Power, a very short, succinct title. He had a book out about the film Tommy, published by PS Publishing last year, I think. And his collection of essays, My Life in Horror, is out on the 11th of June, which is from blogs he wrote over at Ginger Nuts of Horror, where Kit also occasionally reviews. As well as being an author writing splatterpunk and other styles, he's also lead singer and chief lyricist for Disciples of Gonzo. Mike Carey, people know, has worked extensively in the field of comic books, writing, among others, Lucifer, The Unwritten, X-Men and the Dollhouse Family. He then moved into prose fiction with the Felix Castor novels. He wrote the screenplay for the movie adaptation of his post-apocalyptic novel, The Girl with All the Gifts, which I understand sold over 1 million copies. And for the screenplay, he received a British Screenwriters Award for Best Newcomer at the age of 58. He's also co-written 2 novels with his wife Linda and their daughter Louise. And finally, last but by no means least, is Tim. Tim Lebbon is a New York Times best-selling horror, thriller and fantasy writer from a little village in South Wales. He's written over 30 novels, including several in collaboration with Christopher Golden, as well as dozens of novellas and hundreds of short stories. Now, Tim has won 4 British Fantasy Awards, a Bram Stoker Award and a Scribe, as well as being shortlisted for the prestigious World Fantasy and Shirley Jackson Awards. His novel The Silence was released, I think, last year or the year before, as a movie starring Kiernan Shipka and Stanley Tucci. And Tim loves running, biking and swimming, and often tries to put them all together in long-distance triathlons. He's also written a handful of tie-in projects connected to the Alien, Predator, Star Wars and Hellboy universes. And his latest book is eco-thriller Eden. Hopefully there's nothing that I've missed there from your extensive back catalogues, gentlemen. So our theme today is what if, which is possibly the most fantastic question for an author to be asked. It gives you so much room to play with. For this panel, I was asked by Anne to look at the Book of Coley, to look at Eden, and to look at Breaking Point. I think what would be useful is if you each give, and maybe we'll start with Kit here, if you each sort of give a bit of an overview as to what those books are, and, you know, why they fall under the theme of what if, particularly.
Okay, thanks, Phil. And I just, before I start, just want to echo what everyone else said. That was a great reading, Callum. Well done. Really, really great stuff. Yeah, and thanks for setting us off there. So Breaking Point is a collection of 4 stories that I wrote fairly early on, and they're sort of very short novella length or long short story length. So they're classic kind of awkward fit stories that didn't really fit anywhere else. And part of the reason that they are the length they are is because they weren't in any way written for market. At that time that I wrote those stories, I was really learning how to be a writer. So the what ifs are kind of surprisingly mechanical rather than inspirational. And what I mean by that is I don't recall for any of them getting a lightning bolt kind of like, oh, I really, what if, what if a man knocked you off your bike and dragged you in a room and said he was going to torture you to death? Which is that's Lifeline, the first story in the collection. Or what if you found yourself in horrendous debt and then were offered a way out that involved, getting involved with someone who you've known from school who is very dodgy and doing something that was clearly very illegal. So that wasn't how those stories started. They each started as a kind of challenge to myself as a writer. So in the case of Lifeline, the Splatterpunk story, it was very much about, can you write extreme horror? Are you capable of writing a narrative that is a sustained series of torture sequences that is not prurient and is not boring, and maintains, and actually, do you have the stomach for it? So it was genuinely kind of a test as a writer. And the other stories in the book are similar. So Loving Husband and A Faithful Wife, I was attempting to pull off a trick I've only ever seen done in Boswell's Life of Johnson. Mm-hmm. So in Boswell's Life of Johnson, you end up in a situation where you know the subject of the book, Samuel Johnson, better than Boswell, his biographer, himself does. There's a moment in the book where Johnson takes the mick out of Boswell and Boswell doesn't realize it. And he's writing in the book saying, I don't understand why my friend said this thing. It really upset me and I'm really bothered. And it's like, you're reading it going, it's because he's taking the mick out of you, mate. Because at that point, you understand Johnson better than Boswell does. So I wanted to have a story that was a first person narrative where you, the reader, began to understand something that the person telling you the story didn't. And I didn't actually pull that off, but I got a very good story out of it. So, and that one remains one of my kind of white elephants. I keep chasing that as a narrative trick. I haven't managed to pull that off yet. So yeah, they weren't, interestingly, perhaps for the purposes of this conversation, I've had other stories that were very much lightning bolts about the concepts I wanted to write about. But these stories for this collection, actually, the roots are, for the most part, mechanical. They were writing challenges.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Kit. Tim, I'm going to shift on to you. So Kit's stories are very much sort of set in the here and now of today. You're so with Eden, you're slightly, I don't know, maybe 10 years in the future, something like that, I'm guessing. So how did Eden come around? Do you want to sort of give an overview of it?
It was a bit like Kit. It wasn't, I have very few lightning bolt stories, very few lightning bolt ideas that come to me and punch me between the eyes and say, this is the whole story in one go. Mine are painstakingly chipped out of, the Stephen King's old thing. You get a lump of rock and you carve a story out of it. That's what most of my stuff comes into being. And Eden was pretty much like that. But it did start with a sort of a what if idea, and it's what if humanity came together and actually tried to combat climate change. So the concept of Eden is, it's set near future, and in my head I'm sort of 30-40 years in the future maybe, so it's recognizable, but it's still sort of contemporary in many ways, in many aspects. The tech's not that much different, but we've tipped over the climate change, the tipping point. the world's gone to shit even more than it has at the moment. Climate-wise, let's not talk about any other wise at the moment. I'm sure we'll get on to other stuff. And the nations of the earth have come together and decided that we're going to create a series of vast, they call them virgin zones, vast areas of land around the planet that we're giving back to nature, handing back to the natural world, withdrawing humanity from them completely, for these places to be reclaimed by nature and become essentially the lungs of the planet. I think probably the seed of the idea was thinking about, because I came up with the idea in New York, and Central Park is known as the lungs of New York. It's like the vast area of green in the center of the city that breathes for the city, as it were. So I think that was probably the seed of the idea. What if humanity came together and created all these huge areas? And I thought it was an original idea, actually. But then I was reading a National Geographic after I'd finished the novel, and there was an article about a Russian turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century. The Russians set up a zone called Zaprovnik, I think it was called, and it's essentially a virgin zone. It's an area of Siberia that was given back to nature, and humans weren't allowed there. It wasn't an experiment. It was just like, let nature have this area. Eden, and I sort of combined the idea with, they say write about what you know, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So I combined it with the endurance sport idea. So my main virgin zone, Eden, is attractive to adventure racers. So they decide, even though humans aren't allowed in there, they decide they're going to be the first team to race from one side to the other, 300 or 400 miles. And they discover that nature has reasserted itself in unexpected ways in these areas. So yeah, I could go on at length, but I hate spoilering. And
all right, I'm sure we'll get into more detail on pieces later. Yeah. And it was, I did have a wry smile when reading one of your pieces, and there was endurance running in there, and I thought, yeah, Tim's very much going to.
I've done it before. I've done it before. I wrote a thriller which was essentially, it was a triathlon with somebody shooting at you, but and that was The Hunt. But this was sort of more combining it with more genre, more sort of horror ideas. So yeah.
Thank you, Mike. So the Book of Coley. So we've gone from Kit being about kind of today, Tim about 50 years on. You're somewhere around 150, 200 years in the future, I'm sort of guessing.
It's actually, as we found out in the third book in the trilogy, it's 365 years on from now. And it's a post-apocalyptic story. So the what if is the very familiar one. What if the worst happens? And there's a certain amount of overlap with Tim's story in that the apocalypse that's kind of wiped away our civilization had a lot to do with climate breakdown, but it also had a lot to do with the scientific interventions that were intended to reverse climate breakdown. So at a certain point, they tried all of the sort of the weird blue sky schemes that are being floated now. So they seeded the atmosphere with silver. They sowed vast algal blooms in the oceans. They went in for huge amounts of genetic engineering to try to reforest areas where deforestation had caused soil erosion. And now they're living with all of those cock-ups, as well as the aftermath of the resource wars that happened when the biosphere began to completely fall apart. So Coley's world is completely severed from ours. The other thing that's happened is there's been a concerted attempt to wipe out literacy. There are no books in Coley's world. He doesn't know what a book is. And very, very late in life, he learns how to read and write, and he's telling us the story of his childhood in the north of England, in a village called Mithenrud, surrounded by feral nature at its worst. And it's not just the animals that are dangerous, the trees are dangerous. The trees have been genetically altered so that they can feed on various kinds of living tissue. And if the sun is out, they have tropisms that will take them towards anything that has a body heat signature. So if you're in the forest and the sun comes out, then you're dead, basically. The trees will attack you. In Coley's village, there are a few pieces of legacy technology. Most of the technology from our time has long ago degraded, but there were a few things that were made just before the collapse that had the capacity to self-repair. And in Coley's village, there are just four pieces of technology, a computer database and 3 weapons, and they choose their users. When you reach the age of 15, you get to try out with the tech. You get to choose one piece of tech and pick it up. And if it wakes in your hand and responds to you, then you become a member of the elite group, the Ramparts, who are the protectors and de facto rulers of the village. And the story starts with Coley going in for his testing, which he fails, because strangely, only the members of one family ever succeed. Weirdly, the tech always chooses the Venastans. So Coley tries and fails, and then he gets a hint that the fix is in, and that he's been robbed of the chance to really try out with the tech. So he steals a piece of tech, and the story then sort of unwinds from the consequences of that horrifically bad decision. What he steals is not a weapon. It's a music console. It's an entertainment console with an AI in it, and the AI has a name and a personality. It's actually a dead Japanese pop star, Minono Aware, from our time, or a little bit after our time. And she becomes Coley's friend, which is fortunate because he doesn't have any other friends at that point. He gets exiled from his village and has to go on the road to discover his world, and in the process kind of rediscover ours.
Excellent, thank you, Mike. And Mike, just, I mean, within that, you talked about that power play within the Ramparts. I believe they're called is the status. I mean, Kit, Tim, and Mike, all of you. There's obviously a good deal of social, political commentary across what you're writing. I mean, how much does that influence your writing in terms of what's going on in your life, what's going on in the wider world, the people you know, the things that you're seeing? I mean, it's just open to all, really.
You can't ever turn it off, can you? I don't set out to write about contemporary issues. It's just that your worldview bleeds into everything you write, whether you want it to or not. And there's a sense that at the moment there's so much crazy shit going on. It's impossible to ignore. And so that pressure to kind of reflect it in your writing is greater. So it just happens at a certain stage. I think post-apocalyptic literature is inherently political. The social commentary is sort of baked in, whether you're aiming for it consciously or not, because you're inevitably talking about social structures and the flaws, the fault lines in social structures.
Yeah, I find it more of an influence lately. Certainly with Eden, the climate change thing has become much more at the forefront of what I'm writing. The novel I just finished during lockdown by hand. I've got 7 notebooks that I've got to transcribe now. I'm dreading it, but I fancy writing a novel by hand, and I've just finished that. It's another. It's not a companion piece to Eden, but it's certainly another eco horror thriller. I'm working on a TV proposal, which again is sort of based largely around climate change and what's happened to the planet once we meet the tipping point. It's very different from anything else I've done and anything else I've heard about, but it's the climate change thing has really hit home with me over the last several years, partly because it's become much more front and center until recently in the news. And also because my daughter's just finished a geography degree, and she's been heavily influenced by the sort of environmental aspects of that degree. But like Mike says, everything influences you, whether you think it does or not. Whether it's a conscious part of what you're writing, it all bleeds into what you're producing. Really, you're a product of your times and a product of your surroundings and your society. Really. And that's only good, I think.
Yeah, I think all of that's right, and I think for me as well, I'm in some ways in a very fortunate position because whilst I'm incredibly passionate about my writing and I work on it a lot, it's not my primary source of income at the moment. It does mean that I have a complete freedom when I sit down at the keyboard still to this day in terms of what I decide to write about on a given day. So my writing very much reflects my preoccupations and obsessions in a very kind of single-minded way, actually, I think a lot of the time. And it's funny because I talked about how the stories in Breaking Point were arrived at by a very mechanical way, and they were arrived at by a process of writing challenge, and yet when I read them back, I'm very struck by how they share certain quite they share a kind of almost obsessive theme of how people deal with crushing outside forces. I think the theme of all four stories really is about when people are placed by circumstances outside their control into situations where they have no good choices and what they do at that point. And that's not party political, but that is obviously seriously political in terms of like how you view the world, right? That's me working through my anxieties and fears and anger about the way the world is structured at the moment, and the fact that it seems to me that we are all at the moment, do I really mean that? Yeah, I think I do. We are all at the moment potential victims of forces that are completely beyond our control, whether it's climate change or police brutality or creeping authoritarianism in governments, these or just raw, ugly, brutal, tooth and claw economics. The vast majority of us have absolutely no control over any of those factors, and yet within our lifetimes, they are going to wreak havoc, the likes of which we've never seen as a species. So yeah, I think the politics comes in. I think it has to, and I think if you're a horror writer, especially at the moment, I think that it's just, these are such scary times. You do sometimes feel redundant. I think that's probably the only thing.
Yeah.
You got to look at the headlines and think, how the hell am I supposed to top that? And maybe you're not. Maybe our job is more reportage these days. I had to give a shout out to Adam Neville here as well, whose novel Lost Girl, thank you.
Yeah.
Really was, and that's one of the first ones I was aware of that really tackled the climate change and the resulting collapse in a really clear-eyed, fierce kind of way. And I know that book doesn't get enough credit, and I know that he's talked about how he sort of he's very proud of that one, and I wish that got a bit more attention, that book, because I think it was a kind of canary in the coal mine, and I feel like a lot of us maybe are catching up to where Adam was a few years ago, which is often the case because Adam's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic book, and I'm just thinking of I'm thinking of writers that we've got on the call here. You know, Mike's the Girl with All the Gifts. That sort of like the storyline there is I would say subtly towards environmental issues.
Yeah. There's a lot of sort of reflection there on our stewardship of the environment, and I enjoyed when we did the movie. I really enjoyed seeing the scenes where they're walking into London through streets where mature forests have started to grow up through the asphalt. It sort of made the point much more powerfully than the words in the novel did. That basically, if we do disappear, nature won't bat an eyelid. It'll just fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
Mike, just quickly, I know just in case anyone's not seen the chat, I've said to the audience, we are open for questions. There'll be about 10 minutes at the end, but do post some. And Jim McLeod has asked Mike why, and this might be a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read The Girl with All the Gifts, did you decide on a fungus for being responsible for the zombie outbreak?
That's a good question, and it was actually quite a late decision. The Girl with All the Gifts came from a short story called Iphigenia and Owlet, and in the short story, I just vaguely said there was a virus, and then when I started work on the novel and simultaneously on the screenplay, at a certain point, Colin McCarthy, the director, said, "Yeah, that's a bit shitty, though, isn't it? It's just saying it's a virus." Given that the story revolves around the search for a cure, and the sort of moral compromises that are entailed by the search for the cure, he said, you really need to have a better sense of what the pathogen is. And I said, yeah, you're right. So I went shopping for a suitable pathogen, and I found Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, which is just a gift that keeps on giving. One of these terrifying organisms that actually does hijack the nervous systems of the more complex life forms that it parasitizes. And at a certain point, I picked up a book by Royce Salter called Parasite Rex. which is basically expounding the thesis that although the idea of the top of the evolutionary tree is pretty meaningless, if there is a top of the evolutionary tree, it's probably parasites. Because they represent, in terms of biomass, they are far and away the most successful organisms in the world. And there are many that affect mammals, including us. There's a lot of evidence that Toxoplasma gondii can actually influence human behavior. That if it's present in your system, it affects your ability to calculate risk, so that you're more likely to die by, for example, walking under a bus. So yeah, I went looking for the pathogen. David Attenborough handed it to me on a plate.
Fantastic, yeah. I mean, is there other things that sort of creep into your works from the outside world, or is there stuff you've seen in other writers' works, you know, in that sort of like that what if world that you sort of think, God, I wish I'd done that. They've really sort of captured the zeitgeist of what's going on. I mean, you've obviously already mentioned Adam.
This isn't zeitgeist, but I remember because this is one of the questions you sent us around in advance. I was thinking about it. This is a bit left field, but I think one of the best ideas anybody ever came up with for a setting and a series was the Discworld. I'm in absolute awe of the Discworld as a universe, because it was just such a genius way to kind of capture a Mirror Darkly version of here, and then play out just anything you want to play out, you know, and talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. And it's an interesting series because it is certainly the first sort of 2 or 3 books, or 3 or 4 books maybe. You can see Pratchett still, I think he hasn't quite worked out what he's got yet, or how to really make it work. But once you get to, like, I think around sort of Weird Sisters, Equal Rights, and it's just a rocket ship, man. It's absolutely amazing. And it's the kind of, you know, that I think of that as a kind of $1 million idea. I mean, in his case, multi-million-dollar idea. But, you know, it's just one of those concepts where you're like, I'm just in awe. I'm in awe of the imaginative leap that created that. I think that was a genuinely just incredible thing, like just a gift that we've all got, you know, this incredible body of work based in this universe. I think that was, when you asked the question, I thought about it for a long time. I know it's not horror, but that was the one that really leapt out to me. Like, yeah, when I grow up, I want to be that good. And I won't be, like, almost none of us ever will be, but what an incredible concept.
Yeah. I've always loved destroying the world, and I've done it quite a few times. I actually did a body count once, and I'm into the trillions.
Nice. Nice. Respect.
How do you manage that, Tim?
I think, sorry?
How do you manage that?
Well, I've destroyed the multiverse. I've destroyed infinite numbers of Earths, you know.
Practice, baby, practice.
I zombified them in Coldbrook, yeah. So, massive influence for me when I was young was The Stand. Actually, the first adult book I read was The Rats by James Herbert, which itself it's a monster book, but it's pretty much, you know, it's an apocalyptic novel, really, in many ways. And Domain, I mean, is a true apocalyptic novel, but The Stand for me, which I've been toying with rereading, but it's like 4,500 pages long. So that's a big influence for me. And lately, I've always been fascinated. Something Mike mentioned I want to pick up on is the idea of trees growing through the tarmac in central London. I've been fascinated by the idea of the world as it is now without people. And some of the research I did for Eden, I read a great book called The World Without Us by Alan Weisman.
I love that book.
Yeah, terrific book, and not really scary. Just he takes the idea that humanity suddenly vanishes. It's not like a disaster. Suddenly humans aren't here anymore. What happens to the world? And it's about geography and weather systems and how quickly nature reclaims what we've built here, you know. And the chapter about New York, especially about Manhattan, was amazing because within weeks of pumps failing, the whole subway network floods. The subway in New York is kept clear of water by a huge series of pumps. I also researched the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea and Pripyat as well, because these are areas of the planet where people haven't been for decades, and nature's thriving. You know, it's taken hold there, and it's fine without us.
There's a,
and that, sorry, Mike, go on. Yeah.
There's an amazing series of images online of spider webs in Pripyat.
Right. Yeah.
Because I mean, you're right. Nature is thriving there, but it's also been altered in all sorts of subtle and not so subtle ways by the radiation. And the spider web patterns are completely distinct from the webs made by the same species elsewhere in the world. It's
I didn't spot that. That's interesting. Yeah. It's like, you know, the whole thing about climate change is we're destroying the planet. No, we're fucking up the humanity. We're not destroying the planet. The planet's going to be fine. It might take a little while to get better once we've gone, but we're not really, you know, we're wiping out species and things, but give it 1 million years and it'll be fine.
Oh yeah, no, it's pure ego. It's yeah, it's just an extinction event for us.
Yeah,
the nature will be fine.
We used Pripyat for that bit of the movie. So there's the scene where they're walking through those streets. That is Pripyat.
It's filmed there.
Superimposed on Birmingham. Yeah, we sent the second unit to Pripyat.
Oh, right, okay.
we sent one poor guy with a drone.
Yeah.
On the drone.
Oh, wow.
He went in and did the shooting, and they gave him a Geiger counter, which he carried around with him. And then when he came back, none of the footage had taken, so he had to go in again.
Oh no!
Everyone was saying, "Hope you never intended to have kids."
Oh wow! But there's like tourism there, isn't there? You can get driven in to Pripyat for small periods of time and then brought out again.
There's a homeless community there. There are people who've moved in because there are places where they can sleep.
Yeah.
Guys, I'm thinking of time. We've probably got about 25 minutes left. We're getting some questions coming through. This will build on quite nicely, I think. It says, Chap says, if the real world is leaving horror redundant, does that place a responsibility on writers to try and find pieces of hope and resolution in what-if worlds?
Well, that's a really interesting one. I can't help but think about my novella, The Finite, which came out fairly recently, which kind of epically doesn't do that. So The Finite is about, I wanted to write an apocalypse novel, not post-apocalypse. So I wanted it to be the actual end of the world, not how people survive following. And that one is particularly about, it's an old horror. It's an old apocalypse. It's the bomb, and it's about the bomb going off in London and a small family unit in Milton Keynes who are far enough away that they weren't destroyed in the blast, but close enough that the radiation is going to prove fatal. And it's about how they cope with the last 2 or 3 weeks of their lives and what they do. And it's a father-daughter. It's a very kind of intimate piece. I kind of, even before recent events, I kind of hesitated before sharing it with people and putting it out into the world. But one of the bits of feedback I've had from that is that there were people who said that they appreciated it because it kind of, they felt it helped them kind of face up to the notion of grief and loss. So it's not an easy read and it's not meant to be, but I think that there is still space for that. I think there is still space for staring down those worst possible demons and worst possible scenarios and putting them on the page. And the other reason I think it's important is I'm a very brief anecdote, but I promise it's incredibly relevant. Easy Rider. They made the film Easy Rider. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it and they know what happens at the end, but it's a very downbeat ending. Let me just put it like that. They played it to Bob Dylan to get him to write the song, and he was really angry about the ending. He said, "Why does it end like that? Why can't you have the guy get revenge, or why can't you have it be more, have him be more proactive at the end? It's very downbeat." And Fonda said, "Yeah, you want payback. The movie doesn't give you it. If you want payback, you got to go out into the world and get it." That's the point. And I think the point of dark horror that really pushes it to the limit and says this is the worst it can get, I think it's partly a challenge to the reader to say, if you don't want that, go out in the world and make something different. Find a way through to change things. I talked earlier about powerlessness and the real horror of powerlessness. But I guess if you want to flip that and try and find hope, it's that we are going to have to collectively find ways to become more active, to implement change, vast change, unprecedented change, if we don't want to go extinct. So I accept the point. Yeah, hope is important. Hope is necessary, and works that express and find hope. Yeah, great, absolutely. And I'll read them and I'll need them. Psychologically, I'll need them. I think we still need the darkness too, guys. I'm sorry. I really do. I think it's necessary. And even if it wasn't, for me personally, it's too much of a compulsion to stop anyway.
I think with what's going on, there's been two schools of thought. I've done a few of these like Zoom online panels and caught up with a lot of old friends I generally, see once every 2 or 3 years. And it's, some people just don't want to be reading dark horror or apocalyptic stuff at the moment, and some people are utterly consuming it. And I'm it's not really affected. I don't think it's affected what I've been writing during lockdown, but it's inevitable. It's going to have an influence on what I write going forward from now, I think. There's been a couple of moments where, certainly in the last fortnight or 3 weeks, probably 2 weeks, that I've experienced a sort of existential dread about what is going on, and just thinking this is the end of days, and if I had £5 for every time somebody said this is like living in one of your novels, Tim, I wouldn't ever have to write another novel. Unfortunately, those payments aren't forthcoming. There's always, we're going to get out of this. I think the coronavirus, which is the first time one of us has mentioned it, but I think it's with us. It's going to be endemic in the society for quite a long time, whether there's a vaccine or not, whether there's a treatment which reduces the effect of it. It's going to change societies, change it drastically for the moment. That change is going to become the norm, and we'll get through it, and we'll write about it. And in 5 years' time, we'll remember, oh, do you remember lockdown? Oh yeah, I was planning on getting so much done. I was going to learn to play the ukulele. I never did. It's inevitable. Like Mike and I mentioned earlier, it's you're influenced by your surroundings and events around you, consciously or subconsciously. You might make a conscious decision to write about what's going on, but subconsciously you'll be writing about it anyway, without even thinking about it, I think.
There's a book I read a few years ago, maybe about a decade ago, called On the Origin of Stories, which is obviously deliberately echoing Origin of Species. It was a Darwinist take on narrative. It was arguing that humanity developed storytelling as a kind of prophylaxis, that it actually exposes you to situations that you haven't met in real life, and therefore allows you to emotionally armor yourself against those situations. He was saying, just look at kittens, look at how kittens in their play start to model the adult behaviors that they'll need. What we need as humans, we need an imaginative reach that is greater than our lived experience. And stories give us that, which I think is a bit reductionist, but I go along with it to a certain extent. I think one of the reasons we read horror is in order to kind of anneal ourselves against real world horrors. But I think hope versus despair, it's not always about the text. It's about how you come to the text. It's about what you find in the story. I think Girl with All the Gifts is a really hopeful story, a really optimistic story, but it does end with humanity extinct. The hope is for the world, not for our species specifically.
There's an interesting thing. So I'm just looking at the comments section, and that's almost JT's put his hope about tone rather than plot. I'm thinking of Cabin in the Woods, where the world ends, but tone isn't nihilistic. So I think that also echoes what you just said, Mike.
Yeah, good point.
I'm just going to go to the questions. So we've got about 15, 17 minutes to go, and we're getting a few through. I'm going to read some out and probably get you to do some quick responses, people. So one is Wesley said, this is for you, Mike. One said, lifetime fan of Mike Carey's work, especially Lucifer and the Unwritten. Sorry, not related to the chat, but I've got to ask, what if Mike returned to the world of Felix Castor? Love those books, been waiting a long time for resolution to the story. What do you think of an answer to that? Someone else also asked, would you go back to writing comics? I'm going to ask for Tim and Kit to think about, and for you, Mike, as well, after you've answered that. Is there a what if idea which has tempted you all, but you decided it was too outrageous or unbelievable to go for? So Lila's asked that, and Ian also asked, is there a scenario you'd never explore? So Mike, around your works, and then is there anything you wouldn't touch in terms of a what if scenario, all of you?
Okay. So would I go back to writing comics? I've never stopped writing comics. I've always got at least one comic series on the go. The latest one was The Dollhouse Family, which was part of the Hill House line that Joe Hill was curating at DC, and that comes out as a collected edition of that comes out this September. And before that, I did Highest House, at IDW. So that's always, it's always sort of like a part of my life, and I hope it always will be. What was the other half of the question? Is that Felix?
So that was Wesley. So JT asked about comics. Wesley asked, long-time fan, especially Lucifer, what if Mike returned to the world of Felix Castor?
I've been saying for about 10 years now that I would write Castor 6. And I still want to. I still want to try. I don't necessarily think I'll succeed though, because it's been so long since I wrote in that world. And I'm conscious that you can reach a point where basically you can't go back to an idea because you're not the person that wrote it. When Mary Norton wrote the 5th Borrowers book 20 years after the first 4, she was in such a different psychological space that actually it reads like very, very bad fan fiction of her own work. And I would hate to do that. So I want to go back to Castor, but only if I can do it right.
Right, thank you. Our next question is going to be on, is there something that you wouldn't go to in a what if scenario? After that, something to be thinking around is Damien has asked us, he's starting late in his writing career, 41 years old. I think we've all sort of done, well, some of us done similar things. I know I did-ish. Any suggestions to consider about starting at that age, and career sustainability when starting out, tips on how to earn money, flexible part-time jobs, that kind of thing. But the first question is, what if scenarios would you not touch? Any of you?
Yeah, I've had a couple. I've had ideas, and I've just thought it through. And you know, you get that immediate 5 seconds of like, oh, that's, and then a smarter part of your brain sort of puts its hand up, and says, dude, that's not a good idea. So I think for me, I'm going to talk in generalities. So I'm not going to give specifics because the whole point is I didn't want to do them. But so what can happen quite often is, one of the things that I find I do as a storyteller is I'm constantly churning over looking for spins and takes and something you haven't seen before. We're all kind of, originality I think is a little bit overrated as a concept. I think often what originality really means is blending a different mixture of things together in a way that hasn't been blended before. I think that's where originality really comes from most of the time. But nonetheless, it is a preoccupation. It is something that my mind returns to sometimes. And sometimes there's a reason nobody's done it. And sometimes the reason nobody's done it is because it's a terrible idea, I believe. And I genuinely think there are a couple of occasions, and I'm not going to get into specifics, except to say that my reasons for not doing them revolve around kind of wider concerns about social justice. I think I'm just going to put it like that and leave it. And I think the rest you can probably fill in the blanks for yourselves. But there's ideas where I've gone, oh, no one's ever done that before. That would be a twist. And it's like, yes, no one's ever done it before, but it's an absolutely terrible idea. The twist is, you know, would mean that you would be appearing to advocate for something that's incredibly reactionary and that you hate, and the message would be terrible. So maybe don't write it. And I therefore haven't. So yeah, there's definitely stuff I wouldn't do.
Tim?
I don't think I've ever consciously come up with an idea and been frightened off from doing it because of the reasons Kit says. But I think I mean, I've written quite a lot of books now, and I think you sort of subconsciously know what you can deal with and what you can't, and what you're fit and able to handle and what you're not. So it's never really, and also I don't think I write sort of extreme stuff anyway. I was once handwritten a note telling me I was going to go to hell, but that was after writing a fantasy novel. So I mean, what the hell was that about? My editor got a letter as well. I think that was the last handwritten letter I ever had.
Did Kit sign that or not?
Sorry?
Did Kit sign it or not when he sent
it? No, I can still remember the name of the person that sent it. Obviously, I wouldn't say it live. Yeah, because curiously, it was the name of a friend of mine in the States. Just happened to have the same name, but it wasn't him. No, I nothing. I mean, there are areas of society, areas of, you know, certain crimes that I wouldn't hanker to write about, really, because I've got no experience of them. But I think I hate to use. I wouldn't use the word censor. You don't self-censor yourself, but I think subconsciously you know what you're capable of handling confidently.
Yeah.
And sometimes your mind, you know, you're plotting, you're chipping away at the story, sort of settles itself around the stuff that you're comfortable with. It's good to challenge yourself, but also you've got to know what you're capable of handling, I think.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree with all of that, and I would also agree with what Kit was saying. It's sometimes you just steer clear of an idea because of the way it might be read, because it might sort of like touch on. It comes to be read as a metaphor for things in the real world that opinions, positions that you don't agree with. I did a press conference when Girl with All the Gifts premiered at Locarno. We did a sort of presser, and there was a question from a French journalist who asked whether it was is this about replacement theory, he said, and I'd never even heard the term, and he said, it's the idea that the democracies of the West are moribund, and that we're being taken over by more vibrant cultures in the East and the South. Is this an anti-immigrant story, basically? And, apart from saying fuck no, I was left speechless. That moral could somehow be imposed on the story.
It's amazing what people could read into your work sometimes, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, this is totally off tangent, but it's part of the reason. I mean, I loved doing English A-level when I was young, but it destroyed poetry for me for a long time, because you'd spend a whole week dismantling a sonnet, a Shakespeare sonnet, and the teacher telling you, this is what he meant here, this is what he meant there. He just wrote a nice sounding poem. And the amount of stuff people read into your work sometimes, you think, I didn't even see that at all. And it's good. It's the way everyone reads a book differently, and it's great. But in Mike's case there, sometimes it's a bit scary. People can think you implied something or you thought something where you didn't at all. And that's coming from their mindset, not yours. But it can be quite interesting.
And once the story's out in the world, you've got no power over it anymore.
No, that's right.
No.
You can say, no, I didn't really mean that. It's out there. Yeah. That's also, sorry, that's why social media can be so fucking dangerous as well. Once you say something, it's there forever.
I mean, I do think it's really interesting that, this is not a can of worms we probably want to open at this stage in the conversation. I think there is an interesting conversation to be had about the degree to which horror has very strong kind of conservative, small c conservative or reactionary underpinnings. I think there is something to that, or that there's a tendency in horror to lean in that direction. And I think that kind of, I'm fascinated by that kind of analysis as someone who is a lefty and a horror writer. I'm genuinely fascinated by that. And I remember seeing Joe Hill talk about The Fireman at an FCon. This is 3 or 4 years ago, before it had come out. And I remember I was really struck by something he said about how the whole thing he wanted to do with The Fireman was make the infected the goodies. Because his feeling was that actually in a zombie apocalypse, it's the 1% that will be the survivors. They're the ones who have got the mansions and the supplies, and they're actually the baddies. They're not the good guys. Like in the current situation, that's, the 1%, the wealth hoarders are not good people. And his whole thing with The Fireman was wanting to do the zombie apocalypse where the zombies were the goodies. And I thought that was just really interesting. I love The Fireman anyway. I think it's a fantastic novel, but I remember being really lit up by that concept and, thinking, there are ways to kind of think these things through that are different. But yeah, this is the thing about tropes, isn't it? You can read them like 100 different ways. I also think with zombies, it's particularly fascinating for me because I always think of like Night of the Living Dead had some very, very pointed things to say about race relations in America, and was actually from my perspective, the politics of that movie are right on. They're really strong and really powerful. And yet people do read zombies sometimes in this very negative way. So I think that's really, as you said, with the great replacement theory. But yeah, people bring what they bring, don't they?
Yeah.
Guys, just in the interest of time, because I think that was the start of an hour-long discussion.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's cool. So there's 2 questions which we've got. I don't think we'll have time for any more, which I just want to get your thoughts on. So, question from Damien, which I said earlier on. So it's, hi to Mike or Ol. I'm starting my writing career late in life, 41 years old, finishing my first fantasy novel. Any suggestions to consider starting at this age instead, alongside thinking about career sustainability when starting out? Tips on how to earn money. Kiss and I may laugh here. We're not quite as established as others. How to earn money with a flexible job, part-time job, whilst providing enough free days to also write. And And the second question from Sari K. Sometimes it's hard to pull out of the writing world and come back fully. A transition helps. Where do you escape to when you need to make that slow transition back to the other world? So starting writing later on in life, how do you do that? How do you balance it alongside work? And how do you transition back from the intensity of writing in horror or post-apocalyptic worlds or what have you?
I could answer the second question first. I transitioned back by standing up from my desk and leaving my office. I don't carry my books with me. I don't carry my novels with me all around the place. You know, I don't become my characters. I think I write. I put a lot of effort and love into my books, but I write entertainments. So I find it quite easy to switch off once I'm away from work. I mean, my brain's always ticking over, and I tend to send emails to myself if I have an idea, and I should carry a notebook, but you know, I'll email myself an idea, but I don't obsess about it. And just occasionally you'll get into a dark place if you're writing a particularly dark scene or dealing with unpleasant scenarios. But and the other thing for me is exercise, running and biking and swimming when I'm allowed. Just blows the cobwebs away. But you guys?
I think it can also help to switch to a completely different project, move in between media.
Yeah,
is kind of a rest cure. If I've been working on a novel and been completely sort of like focused on that, writing a comic script, which is, you know, a sort of relatively short project with an immediate deadline, can kind of like cleanse the palate.
I mean, picking up directly on that, so I write fiction and non-fiction, and I find non-fiction writing easier, especially when I'm writing one of the two sort of regular columns I write, because at this point, I mean, My Life in Horror has been running 5 years. The Brian Keane project I'm writing is in its second year. I've got a rhythm with those now. Like, I know what I'm doing with the essay form. I know I'm trying to hit 2,000 to 3,000 words. I know I can do it in a single session, and I can just trust to whatever subconscious process is going on, that if I care enough about the subject, I'll find something interesting to say. So I will often use the non-fiction if I'm really stuck on a piece of fiction or struggling with it. I'll do a non-fiction essay or a review or something like that, just getting the rhythm of getting words down, and I'll find that will often then unblock me for the fiction thing that I was stuck on. So that's a kind of, just to pick up on that, flipping between, in this case, you know, it's all writing, but yeah, flipping between, I guess, genres really. But as far as the bit about transitioning, again, I don't. Writing is therapy for me, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. One of the main things that I realized quite recently that writing does for me is I am trying to make sense of the world. And when I'm sitting down to write about something, it's because it's lit me up and I'm not quite sure why. Whether it's lit me up in a good way or a bad way, but something is nagging at me, something is bothering me, something has agitated me, and I want to figure it out. And I'm doing that. So writing's an act of exploration for me. So actually, what I find is I need to write, and if I don't write for a while, that's when I start to have problems interacting with the rest of the world, actually. So writing's therapy for me, first and foremost, actually. So for me, the question doesn't arise, because for me it's more like, if I don't make and find time now to write regularly, I actually start to struggle with being a human in the world.
Also, I think escaping from the real world at the moment is probably a good thing in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with the non-fiction, that's the case, because most of what I'm writing about is either I'm writing about other people's fiction, which is still engaging with fiction, or I'm writing about experiences from a long time ago. And that's a weird kind of escapism too.
Yeah.
Writing about events from 10, 20 years ago, especially right now, you feel like you're stepping back into a different world that you kind of understood. And it's a real escape. Yeah, it's really surprisingly uplifting. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other question, the question about starting late. I was well into my 30s before I started submitting stuff to publishers, apart from a couple of sort of like really half-hearted attempts in my early 20s. I think just don't be afraid, whatever age you are when you start at. Writing is a mechanical skill. You get better and better and better at it just by doing it. So wade in and have fun with it. yeah, doing it alongside a job is hard. It's always hard. I was a teacher when I started writing, and teaching is sort of a little bit 24/7. So writing evenings and weekends, it was hard to find time. But I think Kit's right. I think in the end you write because it's something that's in you to do. It's a habit that it's hard to get out of.
Also, I think everyone's journey is different. Everyone's journey into being a published. If you want to be a published writer, if you want to write for a living, there's no two. I mean, I've been doing it for a living for 14 years now, and I was part-time in work for 4 years before that. And then before that, when I was working, I was writing during my flexi time lunch breaks, which was quite appropriate, and writing in the evenings and taking all my leave off work to write. But everyone's journey is different. And 41, Christ, that's young to start as a writer. You've got loads of time. As for earning money doing it, if only we knew. That's again, everyone's journey into earning money from their writing is different. When I started when I was early 20s, writing for small press magazines, earning £20 for a story, and that was a big payment, I've still got the first check I actually had from, I think, Peeping Tom magazine. I don't know if anyone you remember that. It's £2.50. I've still got the check somewhere for a rainy day. But like Mike said, just enjoy it. That's the main thing. Is totally the main thing is enjoy it. Treat it as a passion and a drive, but you've got to enjoy it as well.
Can I just, because we've come to time, so we're going to have to wrap up. I think I'm just going to have to very briefly say, Damien as well, be polite to people, listen to advice, choose the right advice for you. And if you get bad reviews, that happens. Just move on, because you see too many people get upset and angry at things, and it doesn't help your writing. Thank you. That's been brilliant, everyone. Thank you, Mike, Kit, and Tim. That's been awesome. Any last words before we say goodbye?
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful discussion. Go read Phil's books as well. Phil is a fantastic writer, and he writes really intelligent and emotionally resonant psychological horror that will get your gears turning. So thank you, Phil, for this. It's been really good.
And thanks to Anne for organising.
I want to say thank you. It's a really, really fun talk.
Yeah, lovely. Great to meet you all.
Really enjoyed it. And I just say to everyone, be safe and be kind. Kindness is the way through this.
Yeah.
Definitely.
100%.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers, guys. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.